Welcome to part 2 of our series on building a Zelda-like game in Phaser 3. In this video, we'll be setting up our player character, laying the foundation for movement, interactions, and future mechanics. If you're new here, this is part of a full series where we'll create a Zelda-inspired game from scratch. Check out the playlist in the description to start from the beginning. Alright, let's jump in and get started. Now that we finished setting up our project, it's time for us to move on to our player. For our player game object, we will need the ability to have our player collide with other game objects in our scene, and we want to be able to play different animations, such as when our player's idle or it's moving around our scene, we'd have a different animation. To support this, for our player game object, we'll use a Phaser Physics Arcade Sprite. This will allow us to have a physics body and allow us to play different animations. To create our player game object, let's go into our code. Under our source folder, let's add a new subfolder. We'll call this Game Objects. Then under this new folder, let's make another folder, and we'll call this Player. Now we'll make a new file under Player. We'll call this player.ts. Let's start off by exporting our class. We'll do export class. We'll call this Player. We're going to extend the Phaser Physics Arcade Sprite. Let's add in our constructor, and then let's call Super. So in order to extend our Phaser Physics Arcade Sprite, we'll need to provide the position for our game object, our texture, and an optional frame. To pass these arguments in, we'll add a new object to our constructor. We're going to call this config, and for our type, let's just call this player config. And in this object, this is where we'll pass in all those properties. Let's come to the top of our file. Let's do export type. We'll do our player config. First, we'll have our Phaser scene, so we'll add in scene. Next, we'll need to have our X and Y position. So we'll make a new type for this. We're just going to call this position, and we'll do position. Now let's add an asset key. This will be our string. And then we'll add an optional frame. So for our player, we'll be using a sprite sheet. And so this will be made up of multiple images. And by providing our frame here, we can choose our starting frame for our player. Real quick, let's define our position type. Let's go into our code. We go under common. Let's go into our types file. Let's add a new type. We'll do export type. We'll call this position. We're going to set that equal to an object, and we'll just have two properties. We'll have X and Y. So both of these will be in our numbers. We'll come back here. Let's import that in. Let's come back down to our player class, and now we need to pass in our configuration object properties to this method. So instead of doing config.scene, config.position, we're going to pull these properties and destructure them from our config object here. So let's do const. We'll have our bracket, and so let's do scene. We'll do position. Let's do our asset key, and we'll do our frame. We'll set that equal to config, and now we'll do the same thing for X and Y, and so we'll do X, Y from our position. So now down our super method, let's pass in our scene, our X, or Y. We'll do our asset key, and now we'll do our frame, and then we'll do a fallback of 0 if our frame's not provided. Now that we've created our game object, because we're extending our Phaser class here, we need to add it to our scene since it's an existing game object. To do that, we'll do scene, we'll do add, we'll do existing, and we want to reference this instance of our player. We'll also want to enable physics for this. So we need to do a similar thing for our physics system. So we'll do scene, physics, let's do add, we'll do existing, and we'll do this. Now that we have our player, let's create an instance in our scene. So in our code, let's go into our scenes, let's go into our game scene. It's not our game scene class. Let's add in a property to keep track of our player. And so we'll have player. We'll type this to our player class. Now we'll come down to our create method. After we create our text, we'll do this. We'll reference our player. We're going to set equal to new player. Now we need to provide our configuration. So we'll have our scene. Now for our X and Y, so let's do our position. And we're just going to do it in the middle of our screen. And so we're just going to reference this code here. So I'm just going to copy this. And we'll update this to have Y. So now we need our asset key, and now for our asset key, we're going to reference our asset keys object, and then we'll reference our player. And so our assets key object here, this just has all of our keys that we'll be using for the assets that we load from our preload scene. And so our asset keys is just an object with all of the keys that are used when we load in our assets. So now if we jump back to our game scene, let's go ahead and add in our frame. It is optional, but let's go ahead and add in 0 here. Let's go back to our player class. We'll need to fix our import. Since we're extending Phaser here, we need to make sure we import that into our file. And now when we save, our browser should refresh, and we should see our player game object appear in our scene. Next for our player, let's add in our idle animation. To do this, we need to tell Phaser about our assets, and we need to tell Phaser which frames of our sprite sheet we want to use for our animation. How our assets are currently set up, under our assets folder under images, under player, we have this main_green JSON and this main_green PNG file. The assets for our player we're using we're creating a sprite. And one of the things we can do is we can export out our player assets into a special format, and we can use our tags from our frames inside that file to create our animations. What that looks like is in our main_green JSON file. This file has a reference to each of our individual frames from our player file. And then at the very bottom, we have all of these tags that are a reference to our frames that make up a specific animation. As an example for our player idle animation here, it's going to use our frames 1 through 4 from that file. And by exporting out this file into this format, we can easily tell Phaser to create our animations from this. And so that'll be the approach we'll do here instead of manually doing this through our code. So if we come over to our preload scene, once we've loaded in our assets, this would be the time we can now create our animations. So we want to make sure our assets are first loaded before we attempt to do this. So in our create method, this is where we'll do that. Let's add a new method to our class. And so we're going to call this create animations. We won't return anything from this method. And to create our animations, we can do this to reference our scene. We'll do anims to reference our animation manager. And now we're going to do create from a sprite. So from this method, we can just provide our asset that we want to use and then the optional tags for the animations we want to create. If we omit our tags, Phaser will create all of the animations for the tags that are in that file. So let's reference our asset keys, and now we want to reference our player. Real quick, if we go into our data folder under our assets and we go to our assets JSON, if we look for our player, we're going to see that references our images folder, and it's going to reference our texture URL here for our main_green. So the two files we just looked at, and we'll see our type is a sprite. So as long as we load in our file type this way, we can then call our create animation like we did here, and it'll create our animations. Now we just need to call our method. So we'll call that from our create method before we transition to our game scene. Now under the hood, Phaser's going to create all these animations and add them to our animation manager. So now back in our player class, we should be able to call this.play to play out our animation. So let's do this, let's do play. Now we can provide our configuration. Now we want to provide our animation name that we want to play. And so we're going to do player animation keys, and we're going to do idle down. And now we can do any other settings for our animation. For our idle, we want this just to repeat, so we'll do -1, so it repeats indefinitely. Now our player animation keys here, these are going to reference all of our various animations from that JSON file. So instead of having to manually type these out, we can use this object here to reference those. So we'll see our player idle down should match what is in our JSON file here. So now back over in our scene, when our browser refreshes, we'll see our player is now animated with our idle animation. That's it for this part of the series. If you found this helpful, be sure to hit the like button. It really helps out the channel. And if you're following along, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. If you have any questions or want to share your progress, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Alright, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.